An early autumn morning settled peacefully over Black Elk National Forest in Montana. The first rays of sunlight filtered through towering pine trees, painting the forest floor in warm shades of gold. A thin blanket of mist drifted across the valleys while herds of elk quietly grazed in distant meadows. Apart from the songs of birds and the gentle whisper of the wind, the wilderness was almost perfectly silent. At the Black Elk Ranger Station, Daniel Brooks completed the final checks before the day's aerial patrol. A dark green rescue helicopter waited on the small helipad behind the station. Today's mission wasn't an emergency. It was simply a routine inspection after several weeks of powerful windstorms that had left parts of the forest vulnerable to landslides and fallen timber. Daniel carefully inspected the digital flight map, the GPS navigation system, the satellite radio, and the emergency medical kit. Beside him sat Max. The loyal German Shepherd watched every movement Daniel made. His ears stood upright. His intelligent, amber eyes never left his partner. 6 years had passed since Max officially became part of the National Park Ranger Service. During those years, the two had completed countless patrols together. They had rescued lost hikers, tracked injured wildlife, located missing campers, and survived more dangerous situations than either of them could remember. Among the Rangers, everyone joked about one thing: Max wasn't Daniel's pet. He was Daniel's partner. Just then, footsteps echoed across the helipad. Pilot Jack Wilson approached carrying his flight helmet beneath one arm. He smiled as he reached the helicopter. "Ready for another peaceful flight?" Daniel grinned. "That's the plan." Jack glanced down at Max. "So he's flying with us again," Daniel laughed. "I'd be more nervous if he stayed behind." Jack knelt and scratched Max behind the ears. "Well, buddy, try not to make me perform another emergency landing today," Max answered with a slow wag of his tail. But as Daniel reached for the cabin door, Max suddenly stopped. His body became completely still. He stared toward the dense forest stretching across the foothills. Without blinking, Daniel frowned. Max, the German Shepherd, didn't move. His ears pointed forward. His nose lifted into the breeze as he slowly tested the air. Daniel walked over and looked in the same direction. Nothing seemed unusual. Just endless forests disappearing beyond the mountains. No smoke, no movement, no signs of danger. Jack checked his watch. "We should get going." Daniel nodded. "Maybe he smells a herd of elk." He gave Max a gentle signal. After another long moment of hesitation, the German Shepherd finally climbed into the helicopter. The engine started. The rotor blades slowly gathered speed. Dry autumn leaves spiraled into the air beneath a powerful downdraft. Seconds later, the helicopter lifted smoothly above the ranger station. Below them, Black Elk National Forest stretched across the mountains like a vast ocean of green, gold, and crimson. Autumn had transformed the landscape into a breathtaking mosaic of color. Daniel admired the view only briefly before returning to work. Using binoculars and a digital tablet, he inspected damaged trails, unstable cliff faces, and large patches of fallen timber left behind by the recent storms. Whenever he discovered a blocked trail or a dangerous slope, he marked the location for future repair crews. Everything unfolded exactly as expected. The flight was calm. Visibility remained excellent. Even Max appeared more relaxed, quietly sitting behind Daniel while watching the endless forest below. Nearly an hour passed without incident. Then, Jack's smile disappeared. His eyes locked onto the instrument panel. "That's strange." Daniel immediately looked up. "What is it, Jack?" Pointed toward one of the engine gauges. "The oil pressure. It's fluctuating." Before Daniel could answer, a loud warning alarm echoed through the cockpit. Beep, beep, beep. A bright red warning light began flashing across the control panel. Jack instantly grabbed the controls. Engine 2 just lost oil pressure. The helicopter shuddered violently. Daniel instinctively wrapped both arms around Max. The GPS unit slid off its mount and crashed onto the cabin floor. The satellite radio filled with static before falling completely silent. Jack struggled to stabilize the aircraft. "I'm trying to bring her down." The helicopter began losing altitude. Its nose dipped sharply toward the forest below. The rotor vibrations became stronger every second. Branches rushed past beneath them. Daniel reached for the emergency locator beacon. Nothing. No signal. The mountains completely blocked the transmission. Jack searched desperately for a small clearing large enough to attempt an emergency landing. There, a narrow opening appeared between the trees. He turned the helicopter toward it. For one brief second, it looked possible. Then, a deafening explosion erupted behind them. Boom. The entire helicopter lurched sideways. A violent impact tore through the tail section. Metal fragments flew into the air. The tail rotor shattered. Instantly, the helicopter spun wildly out of control. The horizon disappeared. Blue sky, green forest, brown cliffs. Everything blended into a terrifying blur. Daniel pulled Max tightly against his chest. The German Shepherd remained completely silent. He didn't bark. He didn't panic. He simply pressed closer to Daniel. Jack fought desperately to regain control. But the helicopter no longer obeyed him. It spun faster and faster. The treetops rushed upward. Daniel looked through the side window one final time. The forest was coming straight toward them. Only seconds remained. He tightened his grip around Max. Hold on! The helicopter smashed into the tops of towering pine trees. Branches exploded through the windshield. The aircraft rolled violently. Metal screamed. Glass shattered. The mountains echoed with the sound of twisting steel as the helicopter disappeared deep into the wilderness. The sound of twisting metal echoed through the forest. The helicopter tore through dozens of towering pine trees before finally coming to a violent stop inside a narrow mountain ravine. Then, silence. Only the faint ticking of the cooling engine and the sharp smell of leaking aviation fuel filled the air. Daniel slowly opened his eyes. A sharp pain shot through his head. Warm blood trickled from a cut on his forehead and down the side of his face. The cockpit had been completely crushed. The windshield was shattered. Broken branches had pierced through the fuselage. He took a deep breath before immediately turning to his side. Max, the German Shepherd, twitched. A few seconds later, Max slowly lifted his head. Aside from a few scratches on one front leg, he appeared almost unharmed. Daniel let out a long sigh of relief. He quickly unfastened his safety harness and helped Max crawl out of the wreckage. Outside, the air was thick with the scent of pine sap and spilled fuel. Broken trees lay scattered everywhere. The helicopter had nearly been torn in half by the impact. Daniel rushed toward the cockpit. Jack, the pilot, was still conscious. One of his arms was trapped beneath the twisted instrument panel. Fortunately, there was no severe bleeding. "I'm okay," Jack whispered through heavy breaths. "Don't try to pull me out. My leg's trapped too." Daniel carefully examined the wreckage. The metal frame had collapsed too badly. There was no way he could free Jack alone. He grabbed the emergency radio. Nothing. No signal. The GPS had been completely destroyed. The satellite phone had also stopped working after the crash. Daniel looked toward the sky. Steep rock walls surrounded the ravine on every side. The mountains blocked nearly all radio communication. They were completely cut off from the outside world. Daniel removed the waterproof paper map from his backpack. After studying the surrounding terrain, he estimated their location. The helicopter had crashed deep inside an isolated section of the national park where no hiking trails existed. The nearest ranger station was more than 12 miles away. Even on foot, it would take hours to reach. And Jack couldn't move. Daniel looked back at him. "I'm going to find higher ground." Jack slowly shook his head. "Don't. If you leave alone, you could get lost." Daniel glanced at Max. The German Shepherd was already watching him. His ears stood upright. His calm amber eyes seemed to be waiting for a command. Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm not alone." He gently rubbed Max's head. "We'll come back. Just stay calm, and don't let anything create sparks near the fuel." Jack nodded. Daniel filled his backpack with water, the first aid kit, a survival knife climbing rope, and a portable emergency locator beacon. Then he and Max began climbing the steep mountainside, hoping to find a high point where they could contact rescue teams. The climb proved far more difficult than Daniel had expected. Loose rocks shifted beneath every step. Massive fallen trees blocked their path. Several slopes were nearly vertical. Max always walked a few yards ahead. Every few moments, he stopped, looked back to make sure Daniel was following, then continued climbing. Nearly an hour later, they finally reached a rocky overlook high above the ravine. Daniel immediately activated the emergency beacon. He raised the antenna as high as possible. He waited. Nothing. Only the sound of the wind moving through the trees. No reply. He turned slowly in another direction. Tried again. Still nothing. The mountains swallowed every transmission. Just then, Max let out a low growl. His entire body became rigid. His eyes locked onto the forest below. Daniel instantly turned around, emerging silently from the dense undergrowth. A full-grown mountain lion stepped into view. Its golden eyes never left Max. The distance between them was less than 100 feet. The forest became eerily silent. Daniel slowly reached for the bear spray attached to his belt. Max stepped forward, positioning himself directly between Daniel and the predator. The mountain lion lowered its body. Its long tail twitched slowly behind it. It was preparing to attack. The mountain lion stood perfectly still. Its cold golden eyes remained locked on Max. Daniel didn't move. One hand gripped the bear spray tightly. The other rested gently on Max's back. He knew that one wrong move could trigger an attack within seconds. The wind swept across the mountainside. The silence was almost unbearable. Suddenly, a flock of birds burst out of the pine trees behind the predator. The unexpected noise startled the mountain lion. It lifted its head and glanced toward the forest. A few seconds later, it slowly turned around and disappeared into the dense undergrowth. Daniel let out a long breath of relief. He knelt down and wrapped his arms around Max. "You saved my life again." Max simply wagged his tail once, but his ears remained pointed toward the forest as if he were still listening for something hidden in the wilderness. Daniel decided to make one final attempt with the emergency beacon. No response. The battery indicator had already dropped below half. He switched it off and slipped it back into his backpack. If they couldn't contact anyone, they would have to find another way to rescue Jack. The two of them started hiking back down the mountain. After several minutes, Max suddenly changed direction. He ran toward a moss-covered rocky slope. "Max," Daniel called out. But the German Shepherd didn't come back. Instead, he continued sniffing the ground. Then he barked twice. Daniel hurried after him. Hidden behind a cluster of bushes was a narrow mountain stream. Crystal clear water flowed gently between smooth rocks. Daniel smiled with relief. He immediately refilled every water bottle he had. If they were forced to remain in the wilderness for several days, this stream could mean the difference between life and death. Just as they were about to leave, Max caught another unfamiliar scent. He walked toward a patch of soft mud beside the stream. Daniel followed. Human footprints. They weren't his, and they certainly weren't Jack's. The boot prints looked fresh. Nearby, several small pieces of bright orange fabric were caught on low branches. Daniel carefully picked one up. It looked like the material used in professional climbing jackets. He scanned the surrounding forest. No backpacks, no climbing gear, no people, only silence. There was only one possible explanation. Someone had passed through this area not long before the helicopter crashed. Daniel unfolded the map once again. Near the crash site was an old climbing route that very few people knew about. If those footprints belonged to a group of climbers, there was a chance they were still somewhere nearby. A new spark of hope appeared. Daniel placed the piece of fabric into his jacket pocket. "Come on, Max. Maybe we're not just trying to save Jack anymore. There could be someone else out here who needs our help." Max looked at Daniel for a brief moment. Then he immediately took off into the forest, following the fading scent. The two disappeared beneath the towering trees. Far in the distance, a faint emergency whistle echoed through the mountains before being swallowed by the wind. Daniel stopped instantly. He looked toward the sound. "Max, did you hear that too?" The German shepherd raised his head. Without hesitation, he sprinted deeper into the forest. Daniel ran after him. Neither of them realized that what awaited them ahead was even more dangerous than the helicopter crash itself. Max sprinted through the forest at full speed. Daniel struggled to keep up behind him. The emergency whistle echoed once again. This time, it was louder. Still weak, still intermittent, but unmistakably human. Whoever was blowing it was still alive. Together, they pushed through moss-covered boulders, climbed over fallen trees left behind by the recent storm, and forced their way through thick patches of thorny undergrowth. Nearly 10 minutes later, Max suddenly stopped. He stood motionless at the edge of a steep cliff. Daniel caught up and looked over the edge. Below them lay a narrow ravine nearly 100 feet deep. Halfway down, a climbing rope dangled from the rock wall, snapped clean in two. An orange backpack hung from the branch of a small pine tree. Daniel recognized the color immediately. It matched a torn piece of fabric he had found beside the mountain stream. Then, a weak voice drifted upward. "Is anyone up there?" Daniel immediately dropped to one knee. "I'm a park ranger. Don't move. I'm going to get you out." Far below, a man in his mid-30s lay trapped among broken rocks. His left leg was pinned beneath a large boulder. His climbing helmet was badly cracked. Both arms were covered in cuts and bruises. Fortunately, he was still conscious. "My name is Lucas," the man said weakly. "There were 3 of us. The rope snapped. My 2 friends went for help yesterday morning." Daniel immediately understood. Those footprints near the stream belonged to Lucas's companions. If they hadn't returned yet, something must have happened to them as well. Daniel removed the rescue rope from his backpack. He measured the distance. Too far. The rope was nearly 15 feet too short to reach the bottom safely. He searched the surrounding cliffs. There was no safe path down. Every direction ended in sheer rock walls. Just then, Max began sniffing along the edge of the cliff. He suddenly ran toward the left. After a few yards, he stopped and looked back at Daniel, barking impatiently. Daniel followed. About 100 yards farther uphill stood an enormous fallen pine tree. Its roots still clung firmly to the mountainside. The massive trunk stretched naturally across the ravine like a narrow bridge. Daniel carefully examined it. The tree still seemed solid, but much of the bark had rotted away. The surface was slippery with moss. One wrong step, and anyone crossing would plunge into the ravine below. Daniel looked at Max. "No, it's too dangerous." But Max didn't hesitate. He calmly stepped onto the fallen trunk, one careful step after another. His claws gripped the rough wood securely, slowly, patiently. He crossed safely to the opposite side. Daniel couldn't help smiling. You always find a way. He secured the rescue rope around the base of a large pine tree. Then he checked every knot 3 separate times. Taking one deep breath, he stepped onto the natural bridge. The old trunk creaked beneath his weight. Every step produced a disturbing cracking sound. Halfway across, a section of loose bark suddenly broke away. Daniel's boot slipped. His entire body lurched toward the edge. Instinctively, Max lunged forward. He grabbed the strap of Daniel's backpack firmly in his jaws. At the same moment, the safety rope tightened violently. Daniel slammed against the tree trunk. His heart pounded wildly. For several long seconds, he remained perfectly still, forcing himself to breathe. Finally, he whispered, "Thanks, Max." 1 second later, he would have fallen into the ravine. Together, they finally reached the opposite side. Daniel hurried to Lucas. He carefully examined the injured climber's leg. Fortunately, there was no open fracture. But the ankle was badly swollen. Daniel stabilized it with a field splint. He cleaned and bandaged the cuts. Then he handed Lucas a bottle of water. Lucas looked at Max with tears in his eyes. "I thought I was going to die here." Daniel smiled. "So did I." If it weren't for him, Lucas gently stroked Max's head. The German shepherd quietly wagged his tail. Just as Daniel began planning how to carry Lucas back across the ravine, the radio clipped to his vest suddenly crackled with static. "Daniel, do you copy?" Respond. It was the first radio signal they had received since the helicopter crash. Daniel instantly grabbed the radio. Daniel Brooks responding. "Can anyone hear me?" Only static answered. The signal vanished again. Daniel looked toward the distant mountain peaks. The rescue teams had to be somewhere nearby. But at that exact moment, the deep roar of an engine echoed through the valley below. It wasn't a helicopter. It sounded like an off-road vehicle moving rapidly through the forest. Daniel frowned. This entire section of the national park had been closed to all civilian traffic for months. No vehicles should have been anywhere near the ravine. Daniel exchanged a glance with Max. Neither of them spoke. Both understood the same thing. Someone else was approaching. And whoever they were, they almost certainly weren't the rescue team. The sound of the engine grew louder with every passing second. Daniel immediately signaled for Lucas to remain silent. Max's ears shot upright. His eyes stayed fixed on an old service road below the ravine. A few seconds later, a black off-road pickup truck emerged from between the trees. The vehicle carried no National Park Service markings, no rescue team insignia, nothing. 3 men stepped out. They wore climbing gear, but the way they moved immediately caught Daniel's attention. One carried a GPS device, another scanned the area through binoculars, the third continuously searched the surrounding forest. Daniel quietly pulled Lucas behind a cluster of large boulders. He gently rested one hand on Max's neck. "Stay quiet." Max lowered himself to the ground without making a sound. The 3 strangers stopped at the edge of the ravine. One of them looked down into the canyon. "I don't see anyone." The second man frowned. "That's impossible. They have to be somewhere around here." Lucas began trembling. He leaned close to Daniel and whispered, "I know those men." Daniel turned toward him. "What do you mean?" Lucas lowered his voice even further. "They're not rescuers. They're treasure hunters." Daniel frowned. Lucas continued, "My team was conducting a geological survey. While mapping this area, we discovered the remains of an old gold mining site that dates back more than 100 years. There are valuable historical artifacts hidden there. We reported the discovery to the authorities, but someone overheard us. They've been following us ever since." Daniel immediately understood. Lucas's accident hadn't been just bad luck. The 3 men below continued studying a map. One of them pointed toward a location very close to the helicopter crash site. If they're still alive, they'll eventually return there. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Jack, the injured pilot, was still trapped inside the wrecked helicopter. If these men reached him first, Jack would be completely defenseless. At that exact moment, a small stone beneath Max's paw rolled down the hillside. Click, clack. All 3 men instantly looked up. Someone's up there. One of them reached for a flare gun hanging from his belt. Daniel quickly pulled Lucas flat against the rocks. His heart pounded inside his chest. Fortunately, the man saw nothing except a few branches, swaying gently in the wind. Probably just a squirrel. He shrugged. The 3 men climbed back into the pickup truck. Moments later, the vehicle disappeared along the rough trail leading toward the helicopter wreck. Daniel stood up immediately. "No, they'll reach Jack before we do." Lucas struggled to sit upright. "Go. Leave me here." Daniel shook his head. "I'm not leaving anyone behind." His mind raced. Carrying Lucas across the rotten tree trunk would be incredibly dangerous, but staying here wasn't an option either. Jack's life depended on them. Just then, Max suddenly trotted toward Lucas's backpack. Using his nose, he pushed something out from beneath it. A compact rescue line launcher rolled onto the ground. Lucas stared in surprise. "I completely forgot. That's our backup rescue launcher." Daniel picked it up and examined it carefully. It still worked, if used correctly. It could create a simple rope system capable of pulling Lucas safely across the ravine much faster than Daniel had imagined. Daniel smiled at Max. "You've saved all 3 of us again." Without wasting another second, he began preparing the rescue line. Far in the distance, The sound of the pickup truck slowly faded into the forest. The race against time had officially begun. Daniel quickly assembled a rescue line launcher. He aimed it toward a massive pine tree on the opposite side of the ravine. Thunk. The grappling anchor shot through the air and buried itself firmly into the trunk. Daniel pulled hard on the cable. It held perfectly. Good. He attached a small rescue pulley to the line, creating a simple hauling system. Less than 10 minutes later, Lucas had been safely pulled across the ravine. The moment he reached solid ground, he looked at Max in disbelief. "I never imagined a dog could come up with something like that." Daniel smiled. "Neither did I. But this isn't the first time." Max simply wagged his tail before turning his attention back toward the forest. He wasn't relaxed. Not even for a second. That alone told Daniel the danger was still very close. The three of them immediately began making their way back toward the helicopter crash site. The steep terrain forced Lucas to lean on a walking stick, moving one painful step at a time. Daniel supported him from one side. Meanwhile, Max stayed 20 yards ahead, constantly scouting the trail. About 30 minutes later, a familiar smell drifted through the air. Daniel recognized it instantly. Jet fuel. He raised his hand. "Stop!" Through the trees, part of the helicopter's tail became visible, but something was wrong. The cockpit door was open. Daniel frowned. He clearly remembered closing it before leaving to keep wild animals away. He crouched and examined the ground. Fresh boot prints. Several sets. At least 3 people had recently walked through the area. Daniel looked at Max. "Easy." The two quietly moved closer. As they approached, voices became clearer. "Search everything. The map has to be here." The old man said they never left without it. Daniel hid behind a thick pine tree. 3 armed men were tearing through the wreckage. Equipment had been thrown across the ground. Medical supplies lay scattered everywhere. Jack was still trapped inside the cockpit. His hands had been tied behind his back with heavy plastic zip ties. A dark bruise covered one side of his face. One of the men stood over him, pointing a pistol directly at his head. "I'm asking you one last time. Where's the map to the mine?" Jack struggled to breathe. I don't know." The man slammed his boot against the damaged cockpit. "Don't lie to me." "Your partner took it, didn't he?" Daniel clenched his fists. He couldn't attack. There were 3 armed men. He had nothing except a survival knife and a can of bear spray. Lucas whispered, "What do we do?" before Daniel could answer. Max had disappeared. What Daniel spun around, the German Shepherd was gone. He searched the trees. Nothing. Only a few branches moved gently in the breeze. 1 minute passed, then another. Max still hadn't returned. Daniel's heart began racing. Suddenly, a loud series of barks echoed from the hillside to the left. Woof, woof, woof. All 3 men instantly turned. "Go after that dog. Someone else is nearby." Grabbing their weapons, the men sprinted toward the barking. Within seconds, the area around the helicopter was completely empty. Daniel immediately understood Max's plan. The German Shepherd was deliberately drawing them away. "Lucas, come with me." The 2 rushed toward the wreckage. Jack opened his eyes the moment he saw Daniel. "I knew you'd come back." Daniel pulled out his knife and cut through the plastic restraints. "Hurry, we don't have much time." Just then, a single gunshot echoed through the forest. Then another. Daniel froze. His heart sank. Only one thought filled his mind. Max was out there alone. A 3rd gunshot echoed through the forest. Then, silence returned. Daniel tightened the strap of his backpack. He forced himself to stay calm. Max never barked without a reason. If the German Shepherd was still distracting the armed men, it meant he was keeping them occupied. But every passing second made Daniel more anxious. He finished cutting the restraints from Jack's legs. "Can you stand?" Jack clenched his teeth. "I'll try." Daniel helped him to his feet. The helicopter crash had left one of Jack's legs badly injured. Every step sent sharp pain through his body. Lucas quickly handed Jack his trekking pole. "Lean on this." The 3 men began moving away from the wreckage. But Daniel didn't lead them toward the ranger station. Instead, he guided them along a narrow creek behind the ravine. Lucas looked surprised. "Aren't we trying to reach the rescue team?" Daniel shook his head. If we follow the trail, they'll catch us. We need to disappear first. The creek became narrower as they continued. Steep, moss-covered cliffs rose on both sides. The rushing water masked the sound of their footsteps. It was the perfect escape route. About 20 minutes later, Max still hadn't returned. Daniel's patience finally broke. He stopped walking. "No, I'm going back." Jack grabbed his shoulder. "Are you crazy? You can't take on 3 armed men by yourself." Daniel lowered his head. "I can't leave Max behind." At that very moment, a familiar bark echoed through the canyon. Woof! All 3 men spun around. Max burst out of the bushes. His coat was covered with mud. A long scratch stretched across his right shoulder. But aside from that, he was safe. Daniel rushed forward and wrapped both arms around him. "You scared me to death." Max gently pressed his head against Daniel's chest. Only for a moment. Then he suddenly turned toward the forest again. His ears stood straight. He had heard something, without warning. He took off running. "Max," Daniel shouted. The German shepherd didn't stop. He simply looked back once and barked, urging them to follow. Lucas caught his breath. Did he find something? Daniel didn't hesitate. "Let's go." The 3 men followed Max. The climb became steeper. The forest gradually grew thinner. About 15 minutes later, Max stopped on top of a large rock, overlooking a broad valley. Daniel raised his binoculars. He froze. At the center of the valley stood the remains of an abandoned gold mine that had been deserted for more than a century. Rusted railroad tracks stretched across the clearing. Old wooden buildings leaned dangerously with age. Part of the mine entrance had collapsed. But what caught Daniel's attention most were 2 additional pickup trucks parked beside the old structures. At least 8 men were carrying heavy wooden crates out of the mine. Lucas stared in disbelief. "This is it. The gold mine we discovered." Daniel immediately understood. The 3 armed men who had chased them were only the search team. The rest of the gang had been waiting at the mine all along. If they escaped with the historical artifacts, every piece of evidence would disappear forever. Jack looked at Daniel. "What are you thinking?" Daniel remained silent for several seconds. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out his waterproof camera. Miraculously, it had survived the helicopter crash. "We can't fight them, but we can expose them." Lucas nodded. "If we get photographs, the federal police can finish the job." Daniel began taking picture after picture. The trucks, the men's faces, the wooden crates, everything. Suddenly, Max let out a low growl. Daniel immediately lowered the camera. Behind them, the 3 armed men had returned. They were less than 100 feet away. The leader smiled coldly. "Found you?" Slowly, he raised his pistol. The gang leader pointed his pistol directly at Daniel. No one moved. The distance between them was too short. One reckless move would end everything. The man smiled coldly. "Hand me the camera." Daniel said nothing. He tightened his grip on the waterproof camera. The leader took another step forward. "I'm not asking twice," Lucas whispered. "They're not going to let us leave here alive." Jack tightened his grip on the trekking pole. His injured leg trembled with pain, but his eyes never wavered. Then, Max suddenly let out a deep, thunderous growl. The sound echoed across the mountainside. Instinctively, all 3 gunmen turned toward the German shepherd. That was exactly the moment Daniel had been waiting for. "Get down!" he shouted. At the same instant, he threw the camera as hard as he could toward the opposite side of the ridge. Instinctively, 2 of the criminals rushed after it. Even the leader glanced away for a split second. That was all Daniel needed. He charged forward. Using all his strength, he slammed his shoulder into the man's gun arm. Bang! The bullet shot harmlessly into the sky. The pistol flew from the man's hand and tumbled down the rocky slope. The 2 men crashed to the ground and began struggling violently. The gang leader was much stronger. Within seconds, he forced Daniel onto his back. Then he pulled a hunting knife from his belt. "I'm ending this right now." The blade came down. At that exact instant, Max exploded into action. Like a lightning bolt, he launched himself at the attacker. His jaws locked firmly around the man's knife arm. The criminal screamed in pain. The knife fell onto the rocks. Daniel rolled away and instantly drove a powerful punch into the man's jaw. The leader lost his balance and crashed backward down the slope. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of the clearing, Lucas and Jack were being overpowered by the other two criminals. One of them grabbed the waterproof camera. The other attempted to tie Lucas's hands. Suddenly, a loud alarm sounded from the GPS unit hanging on one criminal's belt. He looked down in alarm. "We've got to move helicopters." Everyone looked toward the sky. Far above the mountains, the unmistakable sound of rotor blades grew louder. This time, it really was a helicopter. Then another one. Daniel immediately understood. The rescue teams had finally tracked the emergency location beacon that had automatically activated after the helicopter crash. Panic spread through the criminals. "If they see us, we're finished," the leader shouted. "Grab the crates and get out." The entire gang immediately ran toward the abandoned mine. Max prepared to chase after them. Daniel grabbed his collar. No, saving lives comes first. The two rescue helicopters quickly descended over the valley, but just as they began lowering toward the mine, a massive explosion erupted from inside the tunnel. Boom! The ground shook violently. Clouds of dust and shattered rock burst into the air. The entrance to the old mine began collapsing. Several criminals fled in panic. Others became trapped beneath the falling debris. Daniel stared into the collapsing tunnel. Inside, he could see more people, not only members of the gang. The two missing geologists Lucas had mentioned earlier were still alive, but they were trapped behind the cave-in. Daniel turned toward the rescue crews that had just landed. "There are survivors inside the mine. Get the rescue equipment ready." The rescue commander looked toward the tunnel entrance as more rocks continued crashing down. If they waited even a few more minutes, the entire mine would collapse completely. Daniel looked at Max. Max looked back at him. Neither of them needed to say a word. They both knew their most dangerous mission was only just beginning. The sound of falling rocks echoed throughout the tunnel. A thick cloud of dust swallowed the mine entrance. The rescue team had just begun unloading their equipment when one of the engineers shook his head. "It's too late. If we bring in heavy machinery now, the entire tunnel ceiling will collapse." Daniel unfolded the old mine map Lucas had been carrying. His eyes stopped on a narrow passage marked more than a century earlier. "There's another entrance." Lucas nodded immediately. "That's right. The miners used it as an emergency escape tunnel. But no one knows if it's still open." Daniel turned to the rescue commander. "Max and I are going in." The commander objected at once. "It's too dangerous. I can't allow you to risk your life." Daniel remained calm. "If we wait any longer, the people trapped inside will run out of air." No one argued. The commander handed Daniel a portable radio and a life detector. "If the tunnel shows any signs of another collapse, get out immediately." Daniel nodded. Then he knelt beside Max. "Ready," Max answered with a single bark. Together they disappeared into the old escape tunnel. The air inside was cold and suffocating. Rotten wooden support beams creaked overhead. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. After nearly 10 minutes of crawling through the narrow passage, the life detector gave a weak signal. Daniel stopped instantly. Max began sniffing the air. A moment later, he hurried toward a narrow crack between two massive rocks. From somewhere behind the pile of debris, a faint voice called out, "Is anyone there?" Daniel immediately answered, "Don't worry, we're the rescue team." On the other side of the collapse, the two missing geologists were still alive, but they were trapped behind a huge slab of rock. Daniel and Max immediately began clearing away the smaller stones. Just then, the ground trembled violently. A loud cracking sound echoed through the tunnel. Daniel's radio burst to life. "Pull out now, the tunnel is collapsing." Daniel looked toward the trapped geologists. Then he looked at Max. If they turned back now, they would survive. But the two men trapped inside almost certainly wouldn't. Daniel took a deep breath. "Max, one more time." Without another word, they continued digging while more rocks rained down from the ceiling. They had only a few minutes left to decide the fate of everyone inside the mine. Daniel and Max kept clearing away the smaller rocks. With every passing second, the tunnel shook more violently. The rotten wooden support beams groaned under the strain. Dust filled the air, making every breath harder. Outside the tunnel, Lucas watched the radio anxiously. "Daniel, you have less than 2 minutes." Daniel didn't answer. He and Max threw all their strength into pushing the final boulder. Crash! The massive rock rolled aside. A narrow opening appeared. One by one, the two trapped geologists crawled through. They coughed, violently covered in dust. But they were alive. At that exact moment, a deafening roar erupted behind them. The entire section of tunnel they had just escaped collapsed completely. If they had been only a few seconds slower, none of them would have survived. Daniel immediately led everyone toward the exit. The moment they emerged from the emergency tunnel, applause broke out. The rescue crews rushed forward. The two geologists were carefully placed onto stretchers. Jack and Lucas were immediately examined by the medical team. The rescue commander walked over to Daniel. Then he looked at Max for a long moment before smiling. Today, that dog saved more lives than anyone else. Daniel knelt beside Max and gently stroked his head. "No, every one of us is alive today because of him." Just then, police sirens echoed across the valley. Units from the Brazilian Federal Police poured into the abandoned mining site. The criminals who had tried to escape were quickly surrounded. Not a single one got away. Every crate filled with historical artifacts was recovered intact. Treasures that had remained hidden underground for more than a century were finally protected. Several weeks later, a special ceremony was held in the city of Campos do Jordão. Hundreds of local residents gathered in front of the national park headquarters. Television crews and reporters filled the square. Daniel received the Medal of Valor for his courage during the helicopter rescue and the mine operation. Lucas and Jack had both made full recoveries. The two rescue geologists were also there to express their gratitude. Then the announcer invited the most important hero of the day onto the stage. The entire crowd rose to its feet. Max slowly walked forward. He still wore the same worn leather collar he had always worn. His calm eyes showed no sign that he believed he had done anything extraordinary. The rescue commander knelt down and carefully placed a gold medal around Max's neck. Thunderous applause filled the square. Many people wiped away tears. Daniel knelt beside his loyal friend. "Without you, none of us would be standing here today." Max simply licked Daniel's hand and gently wagged his tail. To him, it had never been about being a hero. It was simply about protecting his best friend. That afternoon, Daniel and Max quietly left the city behind. Together, they returned to the peaceful forest they both loved. Golden sunlight streamed through the towering trees. A gentle mountain breeze whispered through the valleys. Daniel smiled as he watched Max running happily along the trail ahead. He knew one thing with absolute certainty. Wherever someone needed help, Max would always be the first to answer the call.